Good morning, Marcus. How are you going?
I'm good. I've just bribed my kids to not be talking because my wife's out. So if they come in screaming, I apologise now.
It's okay. We're here for the children. It's okay. It's a Saturday morning. Morning, Louise. How are you?
Hello. I've just chucked my dog out, which is not quite the same as my kid, but yeah, hopefully the dog's happy about.
Well, it's great to see you both. Looking forward to hearing the update from Team MixEd. So I'm going to disappear and we'll be back in 10 minutes with some questions.
So a very warm welcome from us at Team MixEd. So my name's Louise Jaunbocus Cooper, and that is Marcus Shepherd. And we co-founded MixEd during the pandemic. And it's a really, really important platform. We're both senior leaders. Marcus is a director of education for a large multi-academy trust, and I'm a deputy head teacher in a single academy trust. So we're both senior leaders. There's not many of us. And the main thing that we want to sort of put out there today, and it's interesting, all the other speakers have been so good, so interesting. I'm learning lots. But again, I've already noticed sort of there's no mention of people of mixed or dual heritage. And that is exactly why MixEd was set up during the pandemic. We mixed race, although that is a huge umbrella, is the fastest growing ethnic group in the UK, and it has been for a number of censuses or censi. Yet we often get forgotten about in conversations on global majority or inclusion or race equality. So we're here to sort of make some noise and amplify this group of people. And none of us are the same. Unless you're related to someone, they usually have the same background as you, but not always. There's very few people like you in this space. So Marcus and I are both mixed race, but you can see from looking at the screen, you would say Marcus is a black man. You may say, yes, he looks mixed. Me, I'm quite white passing. I often get asked if I'm Italian or Greek. And you can make assumptions about both of us based on that. When actually, if you dig beneath the surface, I am half Muslim. The one side of my family is very devout practicing Muslims. The other side of my family, very white British Christian. So one thing I wanted to raise today, when you're looking at creating global majority workforces, is to make sure you are aware of who is in your space and who you might want in your spaces, and how receptive you might be to them. So your race and your ethnicity, your culture will not often match up when you're mixed heritage to what people think about you. So I'll give a few personal examples. Being in the position I'm in, I will hear a lot of things that people think are okay to say to me because she's white too. So going back to Sufyan's first comment about Islamophobia, I will hear things that are not meant for my ears. If people knew that my dad is Muslim, that my family are Muslim, they wouldn't say some of the things that they say. Now that brings two revelations. One, it makes you realize, oh, you're not quite what you say you're doing, are you? You've got there's the persona you give off and there's the real you, and sometimes that can be useful. But secondly, all racism is trauma. It is traumatic, and sometimes I hear things that can really upset me, really hurt me, and then sometimes don't feel I've got the validity to feel hurt or offended. Oh, I didn't know. Oh, sorry. So sometimes it can be, we always talk about masking and trying to fit into spaces, but sometimes for people of dual heritage, it can be quite exhausting, and it can be quite upsetting sometimes what you're hearing about. And so therefore, what we're asking today and what MixEd do is we just make sure we're amplifying those of us of dual heritage and mixed race to make sure we've got a space in all of these conversations and to understand the nuances and the very sort of sensitive areas about identity that you might have. So that's my sort of bit. So I'll hand over to Marcus, who will be able to expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah. And I'll be super quick, and I hope my kids stop shouting. So I think the other thing around being mixed race, so it's interesting, Louise called me a black man. I've been doing some work with our overseas teachers who have come from Ghana, which is where my dad's from, and they described me as a white man the other day, which I found quite funny. What you'll typically find, my culture does not match with my skin color. So I know I am more palatable to leaders because I speak with a Colville accent. I've got an English British culture. So I eat, Sunday, I was booked by a white woman in a single parent family. I had Sunday dinners every Sunday. My culture is kind of white British culture. And what you sometimes find is that's more palatable. So I maybe get to a position easier than if I was a black man from Ghana. But what I found in my experience being a trust leader now is having to be that conduit between and saying, I am privileged now that the 4 schools I look after in my executive role, 3 of them are ran by black head teachers, 2 of them by black women. And what I find myself doing with my bosses sometimes is saying, let me just explain to you when they're doing these things, this is a cultural thing and it may be different to how you would lead, but it's really important that you don't ask them to lead in the same way. So, for example, me and one of my leaders, a Caribbean lady, were having a conversation and we got quite animated. And we got really animated, but it wasn't aggressive. It was just, we were really passionate. And then one of the other leaders in the room left and said they were having a row, having an argument. It was really intimidating. And actually what I said was, look, you've got to be really careful because what you're used to is typical white British culture, which is everything's very, with all due respect, prim and proper. People don't like conflict. People aren't willing to really say what they think. Whereas in Afro-Caribbean societies, everyone just, we say what we think. Like if it's wrong, it's wrong, and we're going to name it. It doesn't mean we're going to disagree or argue. So what I find in my role is having to explain that and having to explain to people that there's a lot of masking going on. So the Caribbean accent or the African accent isn't palatable to certain groups. So I know my leaders and my head teachers sometimes have to put on a different persona. And actually my job is to say they shouldn't have to do that. And so, what interests me being mixed race is you often find yourself brokering this kind of relationship between, I've got one foot in the camp of the accepted culture of school leadership because that's how I was brought up and I understand why people think like that. And also understanding my heritage, which is this is the culture of my dad, and this is the culture of the African society that I grew up in. And actually, those 2 things can exist in the same space. And I think one thing to be really clear about in school leadership, as in any leadership, is the model of leadership you are used to doesn't mean that's the only model of leadership. And it's really, really important that, particularly if we're going to promote Black and Asian leaders, that they do not feel that they have to dissociate their culture from their leadership style. And those 2 things must really, really go together. So that was really what I wanted to talk about today. Please do reach out. MixEd are very much about amplifying a voice and making sure that everyone is involved in the conversation.
Louise, if I can come to you first of all. I was coaching someone last year who was a white man from Northern Ireland, and everyone assumed he was Catholic, but he was married to a Senegalese woman, and he was he converted to Islam, and he was in 2 WhatsApp groups: the teacher WhatsApp group where there was Islamophobia, and he was in the Muslim prayer group where there was actually quite a lot of racism to the white colleagues. And this idea of coexisting in different spaces and the code switching, and as you said, you realize that perhaps people are projecting they're inclusive, but actually they're doing and saying something different. How do we go about tackling that?
Oh, well, yeah, that's a very good question. I didn't used to tackle it, which was my main thing. And I guess that with power, as in authority, comes the privilege of being able to call things out, which is why it's so important that people like me, like Marcus, are in these positions, because I can now call it out and I'll say, excuse me, my family are Muslim. I find that really offensive. That's not okay. And I think, why do you feel uncomfortable sometimes saying that? And I'm like, why am I feeling the discomfort? Why aren't you feeling the discomfort? So what worries me is that it's great for me to be able to call it out in my position of power or authority, but there must be colleagues classroom teachers, support staff, cleaning staff, everyone that goes into creating a school and making it run every day, or any organisation, who have to put up with these. We call them microaggressions, but they're aggressions. They might just be not as loud. They're tiny, silent aggressions that, you know, you're the one in the wrong for feeling offended by that. So I just want to empower people to call it out, or at least have people like me, like Marcus, in these roles where they can whistle blow and say, well, actually, the staff room's quite toxic. I don't think our teachers understand about, you know, you get comments like, oh, there's kids off for Eid again, they're missing lessons. And I'm like, right, okay, well, we don't have a national holiday for Eid, and that's okay, but this is mega important. You know, so just things like that can be such conversational aggressions. And if they go unnoticed, they cause a lot of harm, and it causes that, you know, leaving the profession, leaving the school, or not entering the profession in the first place because you see it in a certain way and you feel like you won't be welcome in that.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for mentioning whistleblowing, because we've obviously got calling it out when we address it publicly, calling it in when we do it privately, or if we don't feel safe to do that, we should be aware of and should be using the whistleblowing process. And I'm always staggered at how many people don't know about the whistleblowing process. I was coaching a middle leader in a primary school, and someone had shared a racist GIF in the all staff WhatsApp group. SLT were in it, and no one did anything about it. So I encouraged her to follow the whistleblowing policy. She didn't even know what the whistleblowing policy was. And that worries me, that staff don't actually know how to protect themselves. So it's using whatever means it's going to keep us safe, isn't it, to share that information. If I can jump over to you then, Marcus, what you were talking about there, the lack of cultural consciousness, the lack of cultural competence when it comes to a lot of white leaders about those differences and how a Black person, an Asian person might lead. How can we tackle that bit, Marcus? How can we bring more awareness to like the leadership models, the leadership tropes that are out there?
I think, you know, look, typically it's getting better, but leadership has been seen as strong, powerful, dictatorial almost, you know, like don't show any weakness, but also done in a very, you know, if I'm honest, particularly in the British schools, my experience is, when I was a head teacher, people used to come to my office and they'd always moan about people. And my first thing would be, have you told them that? And they'd always be like, of course not. So everyone's whinging behind their back. But then when it comes to their face, and I was sitting in a meeting the other day where we were reviewing a school and everyone was saying, oh, it's not very good, the lessons aren't very good. And then the feedback, it was like we just walked into this outstanding school. And I was stood there going like, you've got to be honest. So I think the first thing is we've got to reflect on what is the current culture of leadership and where does it not work? And actually, for me, the clarity and honesty is the one where in schools, 90% of problems in schools is because no one's been told. So do you know that you are performing poorly? Because if you don't, and it's all been done behind your back or in meetings that you're not involved in, that's not fair. Now, this is quite stereotypical, but, you know, I grew up in an African culture when I was spent on my dad, and Afro-Caribbean cultures as well. You don't need to know where you stand. You don't need to guess where you stand, because you know where you stand. You do something wrong, you know where you stand. And actually, what I think people need to understand is, first of all, what we think is the default setting for leadership is not particularly right. The second thing is then, comes back to Louise's point, is, are we willing? When people say they want to be anti-racist or they want to improve global majority, you've got to be willing to try and understand another person's culture and understand what that means. So, for example, when me and this leader were talking very animated because that's how we are together. But actually, that wasn't shouting, it wasn't screaming, it was both of us getting articulate in our points. And when people then instantly see that the words were used, which were aggression, intimidating, and straight away I just turned around and said, you know, what are we doing? You know, did you ask that member of staff if they felt intimidated? No, we'll go and ask them. Of course I didn't. Well, actually, just throwing a word there. And, you know, even the other day, I sent an email to a colleague, a white colleague, really nice email. I showed it to HR and they said, I find him really intimidating. And I just said to myself, you know, to my boss, that's because they don't like honesty. And I'm the first person who's been honest to them. And therefore we attribute that to my race or to my different culture because I'm the first person. Now, if that was a white guy, they'd be seen as being like ruthless leader. Whereas to me, I've been called 5 or 6 times in this job, intimidating and aggressive. And, you know, people who know me know that I'm not at all. I'm just being honest with people. So I think it comes to 2 things. One is the traditional model leadership don't work because there's lots of things not been said. And the second thing is, before you throw that accusation, because it's an easy thing to do, it's just an easy thing to do, reflect on maybe that person's just giving you some straight feedback that is what you need, but is counteractive to what the current status quo is.
And I think just to add to that, it's just triggered a thought in me. Marcus gets called aggressive, and maybe that's to do with his culture. I can sometimes be called aggressive because I'm a woman saying things, and if it came from a man, it would be, oh, he's a real driven, fearless leader, and she's just a bit of a, and so there's that intersectionality as well. The mixedness comes from being mixed race, being a woman, being a Muslim woman, being an African woman. There's all that is so complex.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both. So what I'm really hearing there is about how we all challenge the kind of the traditionality of leadership models, but we also check our own bias in the language we use. That I could say something and Hannah's assertive, but when Louise says it, Louise is aggressive. And actually we're both saying the same thing in the same way. So let's be careful with the language we use about it. Brilliant to see you both. Thank you so much for the work you're both doing on top of the day jobs. I know you've got hectic day jobs as well.